The morning had a chill that gnawed at your bones, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your very marrow. The snow had fallen relentlessly over redwood pines for 2 nights and a full day, turning the forest into a kingdom of silence. White and endless, pine boughs drooped under heavy frost, the wind whispering secrets as it swept through the needles. In the midst of this frozen world, a small, decrepit cabin huddled like it wanted to disappear, its timbers groaning with age, roof sagging under years of snow and neglect. Inside, a man lay broken, beaten, abandoned. Ethan Cole, 33, once known for his quick mind and stubborn loyalty, slumped in a steel cage shoved into a corner. His frame, tall and powerful, pressed uncomfortably against the cold metal bars. Blood matted his thick black hair, his jaw clenched even in unconsciousness, and bruises ringed his wrists where rope had bitten into his skin. His breathing was shallow, muffled beneath a gag tied tightly across his mouth. Hours ago, he had been pursuing a lead, tracking an unmarked van rumored to carry one of the many missing girls from the towns surrounding Redwood. The forest had betrayed him. Rough hands struck him down, ripped away his radio and firearm, and left him to the cold, as though trusting the wilderness itself to finish the job. Far away, in a small cottage at the forest's edge, 2 sisters prepared for their morning routine. Leah Montgomery, 10, slender and cautious, tugged her woolen cap low over her ears. Her honey-brown hair peeked from beneath, her hazel eyes wide and alert, scanning the snow-covered yard for imagined dangers. Her twin, Hazel, was the opposite. In every way, wild curls untamed, cheeks flushed with energy, a relentless curiosity that pushed her forward where Leah hesitated. Both girls wore patched winter coats handed down from neighbors, boots scuffed from years of use. Beside them, Ranger, their 8-year-old German shepherd, trotted with the grace and pride of a seasoned protector. Once part of the local sheriff's K-9 unit under their late grandfather, Ranger carried the memory of his service in every careful step and watchful glance. To the twins, he was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a brother, a living reminder of the strength their grandfather had once commanded. The girls set off into the forest, baskets in hand, snow crunching under boots. At first, the walk was ordinary. The soft sound of Ranger nosing among branches, Hazel laughing at the prints of their footprints, Leah urging her sister to hurry. But then the dog stiffened. His ears perked sharply, nose raised to the wind. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Not play, not curiosity, but warning. He turned down a slope the girls had never explored. "Ranger!" Hazel called, already ready to follow. "That's not the way home," Leah said, clutching her sister's arm. Ranger barked again, insistent, urging them forward. The faint scent of blood carried on the frozen air, almost imperceptible, but enough to stir the dog's protective instincts. Step by step, the twins followed, hearts hammering, as the forest closed around them like a tunnel of white shadows. Back in Redwood, the town moved at its own measured pace. At the police precinct, Sergeant Naomi Harris, late 30s, sat stiff-backed at her desk. Burnished bronze skin, dark hair tied neatly, sharp features set with concentration. A folder sat unopened before her, but she didn't need to read it to know the contents. Ethan Cole had gone silent. His GPS tracker had gone dark somewhere near the northern edge of the pines, radio only static. Her superior waved it off, probably lost, chasing ghosts, as always, but Naomi's jaw tightened. She knew Ethan, knew his stubborn streak, his refusal to ignore corruption. If he was missing, it was no accident. She began calling contacts, checking patrol sightings, summoning 2 officers to prepare. There was danger here, something sharper, then wind and colder than the snow. Beneath the forest canopy, the girls pressed on, Ranger leading, nose low, eyes alert. The trees grew denser, shadows thickening despite the midday light. Don't you feel it? Hazel whispered, gripping her sister's hand. He smells something. Laya's voice trembled. I don't want to know what. Ranger halted, body rigid, nose to the ground. Then, without warning, he bounded ahead, disappearing behind a ridge. The girls scrambled after him, hearts in their throats. Below, hidden by snow-laden pine boughs, the cabin emerged. Its wood blackened, windows boarded, chimney cracked. Ranger circled the perimeter, tail stiff, ears sharp, and gave a low, commanding bark. Then looked back at the girls as if urging them forward. Hazel's eyes sparked with fierce determination, while Laya's face went pale. We shouldn't be here, she whispered. But the faintest sound carried through the boards. A groan, soft, broken, human. Inside, Ethan stirred. Consciousness arrived like shards of ice. Every breath jagged, every movement painful. Chains rattled. Bits of memory returned. Boots crunching snow, cruel laughter in the dark, the metallic taste of blood, then silence. Until the bark came again. Heart hammering, lips pressed against the gag, Ethan let out a soundless plea as he slumped against the bars. Beyond the walls, Ranger stood alert, breath clouding in the icy air. He had found the source of the scent that had reached him, faint and desperate, clinging to life. Snow-laden pines swayed in the wind, carrying whispers only the forest could understand. Ranger growled, deep and warning-laden, his eyes fixed on the warped cabin timbers. Blood mixed with the acrid stench of rust and rotting wood. The Montgomery twins froze a few paces behind him, breaths visible, hearts thundering. We can't. Go closer, Hazel, Laya whispered, her hazel eyes wide with fear. What if someone is still inside? Hazel, wool cap slipping over her wild curls, squared her shoulders. 10 years old, but braver than most adults she knew. If someone's hurt, we can't just leave. You heard it too. That sound wasn't the cabin creaking. That was a person. She pressed a trembling hand against the wood. Her palm felt the vibration of a faint groan from within. Laya froze, terror rooting her to that spot, unable to move, her small body rigid with fear. Hazel's hand didn't waver. She could feel the faint thump of a heartbeat through the wooden walls, weak but unmistakable. Laya, we have to help him, she whispered, eyes wide with urgency. Ranger stepped closer to the cabin, low growl vibrating through his chest. His gaze flicked from the girls to the shadows around the cabin. Every muscle in his body screamed, alert, ready to defend. The twins exchanged a quick glance. Courage, fragile but fierce, filled the space between them. Hazel rummaged through her small backpack and pulled out a tiny hatchet their grandfather had taught them to use for emergencies. We can break the boards, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Laya shook her head, panic rising. It's too dangerous. We don't know what's in there. Someone's hurt, Hazel replied, voice rising. We can't leave him like this. Ranger won't let us. Ranger barked sharply, a single bark that carried authority, urging the girls onward. Hazel knelt, placing her small hands on the first board, testing its weakness. Laya's fingers hovered over the edge, ready to assist. Step by step, they began to pry away the boards, snow crunching underfoot, breath-puffing clouds into the cold morning air. Each crack of wood under the hatchet made their hearts jump, but they pressed on, spurred by urgency and fear. Inside, Ethan's eyes flickered open wider. Light, dim and gray from the overcast sky, filtered through tiny cracks in the boards. The groan of the old wood sounded like a whisper of hope. His mind, clouded with pain and shock, clung to the sound of the bark outside. Could it really be a dog? No, not just a dog, a protector, a guide, a living reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in this frozen, merciless place. Finally, a section of boards gave way. Hazel and Laya exchanged a triumphant glance, though. Their breaths were ragged. Hazel's hands went inside the cabin, pressing against the metal bars of Ethan's cage. "Hold on, mister! We're here!" she shouted, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Ethan's eyes widened. Strength surged through him despite every ache and bruise. He reached toward the girls, fumbling at first, then gripping Hazel's tiny hands as if they were lifelines. "Thank you," he rasped, voice hoarse and broken. "God, thank you." Ranger leapt lightly onto the cabin steps, nose sniffing every shadow, growl low and steady, guarding the perimeter as though warning the unseen hunters to stay away. The twins, hearts pounding, began working on the chains. Hazel passed a small, bent nail file she'd found in her backpack. "I can't believe this is working," she whispered, almost in awe. Laya pressed close, hands steadying Ethan's weakened arms. "You have to be strong," she said softly, every word a mixture of courage and hope. "We'll get you out." Minutes dragged like hours, but eventually the chains weakened, rust flaking under persistent effort. Ethan could finally shift, lean forward, push free, and collapse into the snow, exhausted but alive. Ranger pressed close, his body pressed, against Ethan's legs, protective and unwavering. Hazel pulled her scarf tighter, the cold biting, yet she barely noticed. "We have to move him," she said. Laya nodded, shivering but resolute. With Ranger guiding and the girls supporting him, Ethan stumbled into the forest, step by careful step. The snow crunched beneath boots, paws, and bleeding feet alike. But the group moved forward, determined. The woods, once a kingdom of silence, now echoed with the fragile symphony of courage. Small voices, the sound of paws against snow, and a man's labored breathing mingling with the howling wind. Behind them, the cabin disappeared into white shadows, its secrets temporarily contained. The twins didn't speak much, but their hearts beat in unison with Ranger and Ethan. Every step carried them farther from danger, closer to warmth and closer to life. And yet the forest held its secrets tightly, reminding them that the journey was far from over. Hazel pressed her ear to the cold wall. There it was again, a muffled sound, weak but human. She motioned to Laya, who shook her head violently. "We should tell Grandma," Laya urged, tears threatening at the edges of her eyes. "We shouldn't be here," Hazel bit her lip, but her gaze hardened. "Grandma can't get here in time. Whoever's in there, they don't have much time." Crouching low, Hazel guided Lila toward a broken board near the base of the wall. Ranger padded beside them, his tail stiff, each breath of his nostrils sending little puffs of steam into the frigid air. Through the splintered crack, Hazel squinted. At first, she saw only shadow and iron. Then her eyes adjusted and she gasped. A man, bloodied, gagged, and caged like a willed animal, slumped against the bars. His face was pale, bruises marking his cheek, black hair damp with sweat and blood. Ethan Cole raised his head sluggishly, his fevered eyes meeting the outline of two small figures peering through the gap. For a fleeting moment, disbelief crossed his mind. "Children!" He tried to speak, but the gag muted his words to a hoarse rasp. His hand twitched weakly toward them, the metal cuff at his wrist clinking dully against the cage. Laya whimpered and pulled back, covering her mouth. "It's real," she whispered shakily. "There's someone in there." Ranger pressed close to the wall, his growl deepening, his body stiffened, hackles rising. Not at Ethan, but at something beyond. Danger was close. His instinct screamed that the air carried more than the scent of blood. It carried menace. He swung his head sharply toward the trees, ears erect. Meanwhile, back in Redwood, Sergeant Naomi Harris tightened her coat as she stepped out of the precinct. Snow crunched beneath her boots, the streets nearly empty, save for a few bundled townsfolk hurrying between shops. She carried Ethan's last recorded GPS's coordinate in her mind, a single blinking point that had vanished like a candle snuffed out. She refused to accept coincidence. Naomi was a woman who trusted patterns and details, her life defined by discipline. She drove a decade old Jeep, its heater rattling but reliable, and steered north toward the forest edge. Her first stop was the cabin of Harold Boone, a wiry old woodcutter, who had lived at the timberline longer than most of Redwood's citizens had been alive. Harold was in his late 60s, face weathered like bark, beard stray with gray, hands calloused from decades of axe work. His plaid coat hung loosely over his stooped frame, but his eyes remained sharp pale blue like ice on a frozen lake. He was not a man who spoke easily, yet Naomi knew he observed more than he ever admitted. She found him splitting kindling outside his shack, his movements slow but steady. "Morning, Harold," Naomi greeted firmly. He looked up, brow furrowed under, his wool cap. "Sergeant Harris, not often I see law out this way unless it's trouble." Naomi didn't waste time. She showed him a photo of Ethan, then another of an unmarked black van captured from a roadside camera 2 weeks earlier. "Have you seen this vehicle or anything unusual?" Harold squinted, took off his gloves, and traced a finger over the photo. After a long silence, he nodded once. "2 nights ago, saw a van like this heading into the pines late, not locals. They drove fast, tires spitting snow." Naomi leaned in. "Did you see how many?" Harold's mouth tightened. "2 in the front, maybe more in the back. I didn't stick around. Men like that, they don't want eyes on them." His voice lowered, almost a growl. "One of them looked over at me when they passed. Didn't like what I saw in his face. Mean, restless, like a coyote too close to hunger." Her stomach clenched. Ethan had been right. The van was real, the threat tangible. "Which way?" she pressed. Harold gestured with his axe toward the deeper woods. "North Trail, the old logging road. Nobody goes there now. Dead zone for radios." Naomi thanked him curtly, though her mind raced. Ethan's signal had died in the same quadrant. Coincidence was now impossible. She returned to her Jeep, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles widened. If Ethan had gone after them alone, he was in mortal danger. Back at the cabin, Hazel knelt in the snow, her small fingers fumbling at the jagged hole to widen it for a clearer view. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, pleading, though his body sagged against the cage. Laya tugged her sleeve desperately. "Hazel, stop! What if the bad men come back?" Hazel's heart hammered, but she didn't look away from the broken man inside. "We can't leave him!" Ranger barked once, sharp and loud, his entire frame tensed toward the trees. Hazel finally pulled back, pressing her sister's cold hands in hers. "He's alive. We saw him. We'll figure out how to help him, but we have to be careful." Laya nodded reluctantly, her fear tempered by her sister's resolve. Ethan leaned his head. Against the bars, every breath a rasp. The brief glimpse of 2 children's faces lingered in his mind like a fragile ember. Against the silence of the pines, he heard the low rumble of Rears's growl echoing in rhythm with his own pulse. He knew somehow he was no longer entirely alone. The forest of redwood pines pressed closer as dusk threatened the horizon, the shadows stretching, longer across the snow. Ranger moved like a sentinel, his paws silent yet deliberate, nose twitching, as though reading a language written in sense the twins could not understand. The cabin loomed darker than before, its boards weathered and broken, its windows sealed by planks, but one pane of glass near the back had been shattered long ago and left unrepaired. Hazel spotted it first, her sharp eyes glinting beneath her. "Wool cap." She tugged Laya's sleeve and whispered there. "Maybe we can see more from there." Laya hesitated, her breath shaking as she looked at the jagged opening, her voice cracked. "We shouldn't. What if they come back?" Tears welled in her Hazel, eyes the cold stinging against her lashes. Hazel clenched her jaw, a mix of childish bravery and fear swirling inside her. "We can just leave him to die." She said it with a firmness that surprised even herself. Ranger gave a low chuff, amber rays locked on the broken window as if confirming Hazel's determination. The girls crept forward, crunching snow beneath small boots until they reached the back wall. Hazel peered inside through the gap of broken glass. What she saw stole her breath. The man was clearer now in the dim light seeping through the boards. Ethan Cole slumped within a crude steel cage, his wrists raw and bloodied, his face bruised, one eye swollen. His chest rose and fell in shallow motions, every breath a labor. His tall frame looked diminished by pain, and though his gag muffled his eyes still burned with a pleading fire. Hazel pressed a hand against the wood, her voice only a whisper, but carrying fierce resolve. "We have to help him!" Laya tugged her back quickly, shaking her head in panic. "Hazel, please, we'll be caught. They'll hurt us too." She covered her face, tears spilling freely, her small shoulders trembling. Hazel wrapped her arms around her sister, holding tight. "I'm scared too," she admitted softly. "But if we run away, he'll die here. I don't want to be the reason someone dies." Leia sobbed quietly, but she did not argue further. Ranger moved beside them, pressing his flank against the girls, his steady warmth, a wordless encouragement. His gaze did not leave Ethan, ears sharp, as though awaiting a command that only instinct could provide, while the twins wrestled with their fear. Redwood Town was alive with urgency. Sergeant Naomi Harris stood at the center of the cramped precinct meeting room. A map of the forest spread across the table. Snow clung to her boots, her face drawn tight but resolute. The officers around her shuffled uneasily, some younger, some seasoned, but all aware of the gravity in Naomi's tone. "We've lost Cole's signal here," she said, stabbing her finger at a point near the northern ridge of redwood pines. "It is not random. He was tracking something. I believe he was taken." Deputy Marcus Reed leaned over the table, his large frame casting a shadow over the map. Marcus, in his early 40s, was a man of steady build, with broad shoulders and cropped sandy hair that had begun to gray at the temples. His eyes were calm, almost stoic, but his presence carried weight, an officer known for methodical precision rather than rash courage. "If that's true," Marcus said, his deep voice deliberate, "we'll need to cover more ground than one team can manage." Naomi nodded. "Exactly. We'll divide. My team will take the main trail into the forest, straight through the ridge. Marcus, you lead the second team. Take the logging road to the west. It's rough terrain, but if we move in two directions, we can close a circle. If Cole is alive, we won't leave him behind." A hush settled over the room. Every officer understood the risk. The forest was vast, radios unreliable, and snow could erase tracks within hours. Still, Naomi's confidence anchored them. She had a reputation for never surrendering a case to shadows. Back at the cabin, Hazel wiped her tears and rose, scanning the snowy ground around them. "We need to find something," she whispered. "Keys? Anything?" Laya sniffled, reluctant but obedient. Together they searched along the wall of the cabin, pushing aside brittle branches and icy debris. Ranger sniffed intently, his nose catching faint traces. Near the rotted wooden steps of the porch, Hazel spotted a rusted box half buried beneath snow. She pulled it free, her fingers freezing against the cold metal. The lid creaked as she pried it open. Inside lay a ring of old keys, their iron corroded but intact, and beneath them a scattering of papers crumpled and stained. Hazel unfolded one sheet, squinting at the rough scrawl. Numbers, vehicle plates, transaction notes, things she couldn't fully understand, but important enough that instinct told her to keep them. Her small hands trembled as she stuffed the papers into her coat pocket. "These look important," she muttered. RER's ears flicked sharply at a sound from the woods, the distant snap of a branch. He stiffened, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Laya gasped, clutching Hazel's arm. The cabin loomed beside them, Ethan's weak figure inside, the cold forest surrounding them like a living threat. Hazel held the box tightly. He's darting to the trees. "We can't stay long, but we found something. Maybe it can help." Inside the cage, Ethan's blurred vision caught the movement through the glass. He could not see clearly, but he recognized the determination in Hazel's stance. The way Ranger pressed close like a shield. His heart clenched with a fragile spark of hope. The light over redwood pines was sinking fast, the pale winter sun dissolving into a horizon of steel gray. The forest seemed to breathe differently now, each sigh of wind through the branches heavy with menace. Rare's ears flicked, his body taut with anticipation as the Montgomery twins circled back toward the front of the cabin. Hazel held the rusted ring of keys they had found, its metal biting into her small palm, while Laya followed reluctantly, her breaths ragged in the cold. The cabin loomed larger in the fading light. Boards creaked as the wind scraped across the roof, and the faint smell of blood seemed sharper near the door. Hazel whispered, "It has to be one of these." She pressed the keys into Wila's trembling hands. "You're smaller. You can reach it." Laya's eyes widened, her lips pale as she shook her head. "I can't." Hazel's voice softened but held firm. "You can. I'll watch for them." Ranger nudged Laya forward, his wet nose pressing against her wrist as though lending her courage. With shaking fingers, Laya slid one key after another into the padlock that bound the cage. The first stuck, the second slipped, the third rattled uselessly. Her hands fumbled, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would alert the forest. Finally, the fourth key turned. The lock gave a dull, heavy click that echoed in her ears. Hazel gasped, her body taut with relief. Inside, Ethan Cole stirred, weakly as the lock released. His body, battered and fevered, seemed to collapse forward on instinct. The door creaked open and Ethan half fell, half crawled out of the cage, his tall frame buckling against the floorboards. He gritted his teeth against the pain, every muscle stiff from days of confinement. Ranger bounded forward immediately, tail low, licking at his bruised hands and torn wrists. The dog's presence grounded him, and for the first time in 3 days, Ethan felt something like hope. His voice was cracked, nearly broken, yet it carried weight. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his dark eyes clouded but urgent. "They'll come back. You have to go." His broad shoulders heaved with each breath, his jaw clenched, as though sheer will was the only thing keeping him upright. Hazel shook her, head fiercely, her curls bouncing from beneath her wool cap. "We're not leaving you. You have to come with us." Ethan stared at her, this small girl with fire in her eyes, standing like a soldier, and found himself unable to argue. Laya wrapped one arm around his waist. Hazel took his other side, and together with Ranger leading the way, they staggered into the snow. Each step was agony for Ethan, but the determination of the children beside him stitched courage into his battered frame. The cold air stung his lungs, but the openness of the forest felt like freedom compared to the suffocating cabin. As they moved away, the distant hum of an engine rolled across the silence. Ethan froze, his instincts sharpened despite his weakness. The twins' eyes widened in terror. "They're coming back," Hazel whispered. Ranger growled low, his body lowering. To the ground, muscles coiled like a spring. The engine noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to rattle the branches themselves. Far from them, on the main road to the forest, Sergeant Naomi Harris and her team pressed forward through thigh-deep snow. The path was treacherous, each step demanding strength, but Naomi's face remained resolute. Her breath came in white bursts, her cheeks flushed against the cold. The men behind her grumbled, boots sinking, radios crackling with static. But Naomi pushed them harder. "Stay sharp," she commanded. "We don't have the luxury of slowing down." There treckled them to an abandoned gas station, squatting at the forest's edge, its windows broken, pumps rusted and walls stagged with faded graffiti. Yet the snow told a story. The tracks of heavy tires pressed deep and recent, looping around the side. Naomi crouched low, brushing her gloved hand over the impression. "A van," she muttered. "Heavy load." Her eyes scanned the lot with the precision of someone who never ignored details. Officer Daniels, a younger man with sandy hair and a nervous twitch, adjusted his rifle awkwardly. "Could be hunters, Sergeant." Naomi shot him a glance sharp enough to cut. "Hunters don't leave blood on fences." She pointed to the chain-link barrier at the side. There, snagged against the wire, was a scrap of dark cloth, stiff with frozen blood. Naomi's stomach tightened. She reached out, plucked it carefully, and folded it into a plastic evidence sleeve from her pocket. Her jaw hardened as she addressed the team. "This isn't random. Cole was here. Maybe others too. We're close." She rose, brushing snow from her knees, her eyes burning with conviction. The men fell into line, the gravity of her tone silencing their doubts. Back within the labyrinth of trees, Ethan leaned heavily on the twins, his legs trembling beneath him. "They'll find us if we stay on the trail," he murmured, his voice ragged. Hazel scanned the trees, biting her lip. "Then we won't stay on the trail. Ranger will guide us." At her name, the dog glanced back, eyes flashing in the dim light, and pressed forward through a narrow deer path, half hidden by snowdrifts. The forest seemed endless, yet every step took them farther from the cabin, farther from death. Behind them, the low growl of the engine swelled, mingling with the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The enemy was returning, and thirst for survival had only begun. The night in Redwood Pines grew heavier, a suffocating silence broken only by the distant groan of trees weighed down with snow. Ethan staggered forward, his breath rattling in short bursts, each step a battle against the fatigue gnawing at his body. Laya clung tightly to Hazel's hand, her eyes wide with terror as she glanced over her shoulder again and again. Ranger trotted at Ethan's side, his ears prick-cricked, tail-low, every muscle in his body coiled with readiness. They had only gone a few hundred yards from the cabin when the air split with a chilling cry. Angry, guttural voices. The criminals had discovered the empty cage. The hunt had begun. "Run!" Ethan rasped, but his knees buckled and he stumbled, only barely. Caught by Hazel, who pressed her small shoulder against his leg, refusing to let him collapse. "You can't stop. Not now," she whispered fiercely, tears burning her eyes. Laya, trembling, tried to help, but she was smaller and weaker. It was Hazel's stubborn fire that kept Ethan upright. Ranger suddenly barked loud, a thunderous warning that shattered the forest stillness. The sound echoed, bouncing between the tall pines, sending birds scattering into the black canopy. Behind them came the unmistakable thunder of boots pounding against frozen earth. Branches cracked. A flashlight, beam cut briefly through the trees. A lance of white in the darkness. Ella's breath hitched, panic clawing her chest. "They're coming!" she sobbed. Hazel gritted her teeth. "This way!" She pulled Ethan with all her strength, veering onto a narrow deer path, nearly hidden by fallen branches. Ranger darted ahead, then paused, barking once as if giving a command. Ethan felt a pang of recognition. Through his haze of pain, he whispered, "Your grandfather trained him. Trained him to guard, to mislead, to protect." His lips trembled with memory. The Montgomery twins' grandfather, once a canine handler, had drilled into Ranger the instinct to sacrifice safety for the mission, to throw enemies off balance. Ethan's gaze met the shepherd's amber eyes. He knows what he has to do. Ranger growled low and resonant, then without hesitation spun on his heels and bolted in the opposite direction. His barking grew louder, more frantic, tearing through the forest like a beacon. The sound drew immediate shouts from behind. The men cursed, their pursuit splitting. At least some of them would follow the sound of the dog instead of the children and their wounded guardian. Hazel tightened her grip on Ethan's arm. "We have to move while he's helping us," she urged. Laya's heart broke, watching Ranger disappear into the black woods, his barks fading into the storm. But she forced herself forward, trusting the dog's choice. Ethan felt shame ripple through him. It was supposed to be his duty to protect the innocent, not the other way around. Yet, here were two girls, barely 10 years old, dragging him along as though he were their burden. He clenched his jaw, forcing one foot in front of the other, his mind burning with the promise that if they survived, he would make sure justice came for the men behind them. Meanwhile, miles away at the forest edge, Sergeant Naomi Harris trudged through the snow with her unit. Her dark braid was slick with frost. Her sharp brown eyes narrowed against the biting wind. At 38, Naomi carried herself with a calm that came from years of experience. But inside her chest, anxiety roiled like a storm. Ethan was her partner, her responsibility, and too many officers had been lost to mistakes she refused to repeat. The radio at her hip crackled faintly, voices drowned in static. "Marcus here." "Me, North Path?" Naomi cursed under her breath. The dense pines and heavy snow reduced their communication to little more than noise. Her men, Officer Blake and Officer Torres, both younger and less seasoned, exchanged uneasy glances. Blake, taloned lean, with a perpetually worried face, asked, "Ma'am, what if Marcus's team gets caught off guard?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She studied the white void around them, the hush of falling snow. Then she unclipped a flare from her belt. "We're not wandering blind," she said. With a sharp twist, she ignited the flare. A scarlet blaze hissed and spat sparks as it lifted into the sky. The glow painted the tree's blood red, a silent message cutting through the storm. Somewhere, in the distance, she prayed Marcus and his squad would see it. Torres, a stocky officer with close-cropped hair and a steadiness Naomi valued, muttered, "If we can see it, so can they." He jerked his head toward the depths of the forest, meaning the criminals. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Then let them see. Better. They chase shadows than find us unprepared." Back on the deer trail, Hazel and Laya heaved Ethan into the crook of a fallen log, forcing him to crouch low. His breaths were shallow, every rib ached, but he managed a hoarse whisper, "Stay quiet." They obeyed instantly, their small forms pressed against the cold bark, holding their breath as footsteps thundered past, not far from their hiding spot. The men shouted at one another, confused, some drawn after rangers barking, others still sweeping the woods. One beam of light flickered dangerously close, sliding over the broken underbrush where Hazel crouched. She held Wyla tight, her hand over her, sister's trembling lips praying the darkness held them. At last, the voices and footsteps receded, the sound swallowed by the winter night. Ethan exhaled slowly, relief of fragile thread. "We keep moving," he whispered. Hazel nodded firmly while Laya wiped her eyes, her fear hardening into determination. Together they rose, pushing deeper into the forest, carrying with them the fragile hope that Ranger's sacrifice would not be in vain. Ranger bounded through the thick snow-dusted pines, his powerful frame weaving between tree trunks like a shadow-given flesh. His deep bark echoed across the night, loud enough to ricochet off the hollow cabin walls behind them. The sound was not just noise. It was calculated, a rhythm of defiance that lured the predators into his trail. Behind him, 3 men stumbled angrily in pursuit, their boots crunching against the brittle undergrowth. One of them, broad-shouldered with a jagged scar that carved through his left cheek, cursed under his breath. His name was Travis Dole, a seasoned criminal with a cruel smirk, his leather jacket straining against his stocky frame. He barked orders at the others, each word dripping venom. Don't let that damn mutt away. He's leading us somewhere. Shoot if you see him." The two beside him were less composed. One, lanky and nervous, had unkempt blonde hair plastered to his forehead by sweat despite the freezing air. His hands shook. Each time he tried to raise the gun, the glint of fear clear in his pale blue eyes. His name was Curtis, a drifter who had joined the ring only recently. The last of the trio was bulkier, barrel-chested, and wore a flannel shirt half torn under his heavy coat. This was Miguel Vargas, ruthless but pragmatic, his dark eyes scanning for danger as much as for their canine quarry. They fired into the shadows recklessly, bullets slicing through tree bark, each shot muffled by the blanket of falling snow. Rares's golden sable coat blended almost perfectly into the woodland hues, and he darted left and right, leaving only fleeting glimpses of his tail or ears in the moonlight. His barks came from unexpected directions, taunting them, coaxing their pursuit deeper into redwood pines. Meanwhile, not far away on a parallel trail, Ethan Cole pressed forward with his limited strength, supported by Laya and Hazel on either side. His police jacket was torn, his breath ragged. Blood had dried against the corner of his temple, and his hands still bore rope burns from his captivity. Hazel tightened her grip on his arm, her small face set with determination. "We can't stop now," she whispered, her honey blonde hair stuck to her damp cheeks, eyes wide with focus beyond her years. Laya, trembling, risked a glance behind. She heard the faint crack of gunfire and nearly collapsed with fear, but Ethan steadied her with what strength he could muster. "Keep going," he rasped. "Ranger knows what he's doing. Trust him." The girls exchanged a brief look, both terrified, both unwilling to abandon hope. Together, the three pressed through the snow, each heartbeat loud in their ears, each step a prayer that the chaos behind them would not catch up. Elsewhere in the forest, Deputy Marcus Hale and his squad advanced cautiously through the snow-thick trail. Marcus was in his early 40s, tall and wiry, with a salt and pepper beard and stern hazel eyes that had seen both war and a peace. A man. Of discipline, he carried himself with steady composure, his breath forming clouds as he signaled his team forward. The other officers, 3 in number, spread out, their rifles held close, scanning the tree line for movement. One of them, Officer Kendra Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman with cropped brown hair and a non-nonsense stance, had a gut feeling something was about to happen. The forest suddenly cracked with sound. Bark splintered from a nearby tree as a stray bullet ricocheted into the clearing. Marcus dropped low, motioning for cover. From the gloom, a familiar figure came sprinting. Ranger, his muscular frame carrying him with speed and purpose. His chest rose and fell, his eyes blazing with fierce urgency as he barked at the officers. Marcus's pulse quickened. He had heard Naomi's stories about Ethan's grandfather's old K9. If this dog was here, Ethan could not be far. And then the shadows gave birth to their pursuers. Travis, Curtis, and Miguel crashed into the clearing, weapons raised. "Police!" Marcus shouted, his voice steady but booming. "Drop your weapons!" The night ignited with chaos. Instead of surrender, Travis opened fire. The forest roared with gunshots, bullets whistling through the branches. Officers returned fire, careful and precise. Sparks flashed from muzzles, and the smell of gunpowder seeped into the cold air. Ranger, without hesitation, lunged into the fray. His powerful jaws clamped onto Travis's arm with bone-rattling force, sending the scarred man crashing into the snow and dislodging his pistol. Travis screamed, his voice torn between rage and agony, thrashing as Rares's teeth held him pinned. A shot rang out dangerously close, and Marcus's eyes widened as he saw a crimson line streak across Ariars's shoulder where a bullet grazed him. The dog yelped but did not release his grip, his growls guttural, unyielding. Curtis's hands shook so violently that his shot went wide, grazing only air before a precise round from Officer Walsh struck the ground at his feet. He shrieked, stumbling backward, clutching his thigh where ashert of bark and shrapnel tore skin. Panic overtook him, and he collapsed, dropping his weapon in surrender. Miguel held his ground longer, firing 2 desperate shots before a bullet from Marcus's rifle shattered a branch inches above his head. His resolve crumbled, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. He cursed loudly, then hurled his gun into the snow, raising his hands. "Enough! I quit!" His booming voice carried a bitterness that couldn't hide his fear. The clearing grew eerily still after the last echo of gunfire faded. Ranger, bleeding but unbroken, released Travis at Marcus's command, standing protectively over, the subdued man with his teeth bared. The officers quickly advanced, cuffing all 3 criminals with cold efficiency. Travis glared through his pain, his cheek scar twitching as he spat curses. Curtis whimpered softly, cradling his wounded leg. Miguel sat in sullen silence. The fight drained from him. Marcus knelt briefly by Ranger, his usually stern face softening. He reached out, steady hands brushing the thick fur around the wound. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice carrying rare warmth. RER's tail thumped weakly against the snow, his dark eyes shining with both exhaustion and fierce loyalty. As the officers secured the prisoners, Marcus lifted his radio, trying to cut through the static. "Naomi, we've got 3 in custody. Repeat, 3 in custody. Dogs injured but alive." Proceeding to regroup. Static hissed but faintly. Naomi's voice answered with urgency. "Copy that. Hold position. We're moving to your location." The crossroads had been met, not of chance, but of courage. In the bitter cold of redwood pines, a German shepherd had stood between darkness and its prey. And for a moment, the balance had shifted toward hope. The first light of dawn spilled across the snow-blanketed pines, painting the jagged silhouettes of redwood's trees in pale gold. The forest was quiet now, save for the crunch of boots and the labored breaths of those who had wandered it through the night. Sergeant Naomi Harris moved at the front of her squad, her steady steps betraying none of the exhaustion carved into the lines beneath her eyes. For 3 days she had barely slept, fueled only by coffee gone cold before she could finish it, and by the gnawing determination that she would not leave another officer behind in these woods. Her dark hair was tied back in a taut braid, her jaw clenched with resolve, and her olive-brown eyes gleamed with vigilance beneath the brim of her cap. At the clearing ahead, the search team halted. Through the trees, Naomi caught sight of 3 figures emerging, 2 small girls supporting a man taller than either of them, his steps faltering yet stubborn. Ethan Cole stumbled into the light of morning. One arm slung over Hazel Montgomery's thin shoulders, while Laya clutched his other hand. His uniform was torn, his face bruised and his breath shallow, but his spirit had not been broken. Naomi rushed forward, her heart leaping, and caught him before he collapsed outright. "We've got you!" she whispered fiercely, as though her conviction alone could keep him standing. The twins clung close, their cheeks wet with tears of both fear and relief. Lay's honey-blonde ponytail was tangled with twigs, her denim dress and leggings stained with mud and snow. Hazel's tutu clung damply to her legs, her unicorn shirt ripped at the hem. They both cried out at once, their voices breaking in relief. "Ranger!" The German shepherd staggered into view moments later. His sable coat, once proud and gleaming, was streaked with blood along his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. Yet his amber eyes burned bright with life, and his tail thumped weakly against the snow when the girls flung their arms around his neck. 8 years old, scarred by his years as a service dog under their grandfather's care, Ranger was no longer young, but his spirit was iron-bound. He endured their weight against him, licking their faces as though to assure them he had returned whole, no matter the wounds he bore. Naomi crouched, running a gloved hand over the matted fur, her throat tight. "You did good, boy," she murmured, her words both praise and a promise. Ethan, pale but lucid, reached into his jacket where Hazel had hidden the papers. He pulled free. A crumpled stack, lists of names, addresses, vehicle registrations, all evidence of the trafficking ring he'd been investigating. His voice was hoarse but steady. They left these behind. It's enough to bring them down." Naomi's fingers closed around the documents, and her eyes hardened with conviction. "Then we'll make sure they pay." The week that followed moved with the weight of inevitability. Jefferson County's courthouse loomed solemnly against the Oregon sky, its stone facade adusted with frost. Inside, the benches filled quickly with townsfolk who had followed the case with bated breath. Reporters scribbled. Frantically, flashes from cameras briefly igniting the carved wooden beams of the ceiling. At the prosecution's table sat Ethan, his posture straight despite the bandages still hidden beneath his dress blues. His wounds had not yet healed, but duty demanded he face those who had wronged both him and the community. Naomi sat nearby, her crisp uniform immaculate, though her cheeks carried the faint shadows of fatigue. To her left, the Montgomery twins sat in clean dresses their mother had carefully chosen, pale yellow for Laya, soft lavender for Hazel. Their eyes, wide and solemn, flickered off and toward Ranger, who sat on the floor with his handler's leash draped loosely. A polished silver medallion gleamed on his collar, a gift from the sheriff's office even before the court's proceedings had ended. On the opposite side, the three men who had haunted the forest now faced justice. The ringleader, Victor Ka, a burly man in his early 40s with a crooked nose and a cruel scar along his jaw, glowered at the jury, his wrist shackled. The younger of his henchman, Dale, sat pale and gaunt, a bullet wound still stitched at his thigh, the weight of the verdict already pulling at his hunched shoulders. The third, a wiry man named Brent with shifty eyes that avoided all contact, gripped the table as if it might anchor him against the tide of judgment. The trial did not drag. The papers Ethan had saved, corroborated bite-testimonies from others rescued, in sting operations, sealed the men's fates. When the sentences were read, silence held the room for a beat before whispers rippled like a rising tide. Victor Kane, 40 years in state prison. Dale, 25 years. Brent, 18. Their names would echo not. As predators in the forest, but as inmates behind walls, they could not escape. 1 week later, the courthouse steps transformed into a place of gratitude. The citizens of Redwood Pines gathered in the coats and scarves, their breaths rising in white plumes into the winter air. The sheriff's department had arranged a ceremony in the square. Children clutched small flags while elders leaned on canes, their eyes glistening as they watched their protectors honored. Naomi, who had carried the weight of doubt and fear for days, finally allowed herself to breathe as applause cascaded over her. She was not one for grand speeches, preferring action over words, but the gratitude of her neighbors wrapped her like a blanket warmer than any coat. Ethan stood before the crowd, his uniform pressed, his bruises faded, but not gone. His voice carried firm, though it trembled at the edges with emotion. Loyalty and love saved me, not just from people, but from a warrior with 4 legs who never gave up. The crowd erupted, turning to cheer as Ranger stepped forward with the twins holding his leash. A deputy pinned a gleaming medal onto his collar, the Canine Medal of Honor. The dog tilted his head as though abused by the fuss, yet his tail wagged strong and steady. The Montgomery twins were lifted onto the stage where the mayor, Sarah Whitlock, a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, smiled warmly. Sarah had grown up in Redwood Pines, once a school teacher who had dedicated decades to guiding children before entering public service. She had known hardship herself, raising 2 sons after her husband died young, and it had shaped her into someone who never underestimated the strength of the young. With a proud voice, she declared, "Today we recognize 2 brave girls, our little angels of Redwood Pines." The crowd thundered with applause as Leia and Hazel blushed, holding each other's hands tight. In the golden light of afternoon, Naomi finally stood at ease. She looked around at Ethan alive, at the twins safe, at Ranger with his medal gleaming, at the town's folk united. For the first time in many long nights, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. When the townspeople broke into rhythmic clapping, echoing off the courthouse stone, she closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound wash over her. It was not just celebration. It was remembrance of those still missing and a vow to continue fighting for them. Yet it was also healing for Ethan, for Naomi, for two little girls, and for a dog whose courage bridged the fragile line between despair and hope. Dawn had indeed brought justice. In every shadow of fear, a light waits to be found. Some call it fate. Others call it courage. But many believe it is the hand of God guiding hearts together at the right moment. The story of Ethan, the twin girls. And Ranger reminds us that miracles do not always come with thunder and fire. Sometimes they arrive as a loyal dog's bark, a child's courage, or the strength of a friend who refuses to give up. Just as this town found hope in the darkest night, we too can find God's presence in the ordinary hours of our daily lives, in kindness shared, in love given, in faith that carries us through storms. If this story touched you, share it with others. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, courage, and hope. May God bless and protect you and your loved ones now and always.